All right, so welcome back again, Realty Pros, to our Thursday evening agent training. We have been cycling through our new agent training series. So if you've been with us over the last month, then you know that we've been touching on all things buyers. We will be completed with our new agent training series by the second to last week of June. That is our goal. So we've been going through everything on the buyer side, and then we will transition into the listing side. We've gone through working with buyers, what that process entails. We've gone through writing winning offers. We've gone through contract negotiation. So you know those aspects that are important for your buyers to negotiate in advance, those items that are going to have their contracts be more favorable with the sellers. And we also went over as is with inspection versus without inspection and the inspection contingency. Okay. We've talked about the market, the current market that we're in our area, in the DC metropolitan area, what that looks like for buyers in the midst of this COVID climate, and how aggressive and competitive the nature of our market is. So we've been talking about strategies to make sure that our buyers are getting their offers accepted as much as possible in light of all of the competition in the market and the shortage in inventory. So those of you that have been with us over the last month since we've been going through this, I'm going to pull on you and I'm going to ask some questions because I definitely want you guys to participate. Our trainings are interactive as always. I want to make sure that you guys are asking questions and getting insight. Okay, so I want to liberate you to ask any question that is of concern to you. I don't want you to feel like you're in the midst of a platform where you don't want to ask questions because you don't want to ask the wrong question or seem like you should have known the answer. You are amongst family. So we are Porterhouse family. You're on the line with your Realty Pro colleagues, and I would rather you ask whatever question you need so that you are well equipped with everything that you need in order to go out and represent our buyers well. Okay. So that was a mouthful. I might have to take a cup of water at a few moments or two. If that is the case, I have Curtis on the line and a number of other agents who have a wealth of experience in this arena as well. So I'm going to pull on you to just assist with making sure that we bring this information to life for the group. Okay. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about this as is addendum. And I posed the question to the group, what is the difference in having your buyer to either use an inspection addendum or the as-is addendum with the inspection and the right to terminate? Is there anybody on the line that remembers some of the insights that we gave on both of those different documents? I'll give you guys a couple minutes to think about that. Let me know what you recall about the difference on these two documents. So the as is versus the inspection contingency. All right, then I'll give a brief overview because if you weren't on the line, I want to make sure that everybody is caught up. So your as is this as is addendum gives you two options. You have option A and you have option B. When we're in a buyer's market, you really don't have to be concerned with this addendum because in a buyer's market, almost anything goes. Back in 2012 and 2013, we were able to write offers to the sellers for well below list price, ask the seller to, pay the closing costs, all of the closing costs, all the transfer and recordation, let the buyer have, 10, 15 days on their inspection clause, ask the seller to leave the chandelier and even the kitchen table if the buyer wanted it, because that's the type of market that we were in back in 2012 and 2013 in the buyer's market. We all know that supply and demand is going to dictate the price in which market we go in. And because we've been so well under kind of the need with regards to the number of properties or homes that are needed, that's why the price has gone up so much. There's a tremendous need for homes and low inventory. Therefore, we have a higher price and we have more competition. I'm saying that because I want you guys to be aware of how to kind of navigate through that language with respect to the different markets that we're in and the timing of those markets, so that when you're preparing your buyers in your buyer consultation, you can speak with them about the market that we're in currently, about the climate that we're in. and what successful offers look like in that market, okay? At the end of the day, you have to present these options to the buyer, and it is the buyer's right to choose which of these two forms that they would like to use for their contract or their offer, okay? The first one that we're going to talk about or just go back over briefly is the as-is addendum. As is without inspection. That is very simply put. That is option A. Without a property inspection, so as is condition of the date of the contract, without any inspection contingencies regarding the condition of the property. That one is the simplest one, straightforward, and there's no, there's nothing ambiguous with option A on that as is addendum. Okay, let me ask, Curtis, have you had any buyer clients that have purchased with this as is addendum? And if so, have they purchased as is without inspections or as is with inspection and the right to terminate?
Yeah, I haven't. Well, I have had multiple buyers use the as is addendum, but personally, I never recommend, that they go in without an inspection altogether. So I'm very deliberate in letting them know that it's important that they're making a very big purchase, maybe one of the biggest purchase, in their lives, and that I would want to know what's going on with the property. So we have used the as is addendum several times, especially in this climate. But I personally have never had anybody just go straight as is and not have a home inspection. I also think in the market, even though it's as aggressive as it is, that most sellers will kind of even, I don't think that an as is versus an as is with an inspection could potentially be a huge deal breaker. I think there's other things that would, even for me on the listing side, I would want to pay more attention to than as is or as is without the inspection. So I've used the addendum several times. I'm sure I'll use it again. But I just personally always try to have my buyers like, you might want to have somebody come in, and doesn't mean they're going to change anything, doesn't mean they're going to fix anything, but at least you know what you're actually purchasing.
Thank you for that. Curtis said a couple things that are very important, and I want to kind of pull some more meat off that bone there. Curtis said something about not having a buyer to purchase as is without inspection. And for those of you that have been on our trainings, as per Porterhouse policy, you have the ability to say to the buyer, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, it is our brokerage policy that all of our buyers have property inspections, right? And if they decline it, you need to send them your strong encouragement in writing that they have the protection of a property inspection, and they need to decline it in writing. And you forward me a copy of that, okay? That being said, that would only be for our investor clients that are normally those that purchase as is without inspection, okay? That being said, Curtis also said something else that's very important. On the listing side, whereas the seller is reviewing offers, it's not going to make much difference for them whether it's as is without an inspection versus as is with inspection and the right to terminate. So from that perspective, you can just skip over option A altogether when you are representing the buyer and just be confident in the as is with inspection and the right to terminate should your buyer choose to use that option. Okay. So that being said, as is with inspection and the right to terminate. We talked about this the Thursday before last, and we went, through this at length. If there's anybody that remembers anything that we discussed with regards to the as is with inspection and the right to terminate, you can go ahead and raise your hand or unmute yourself. Otherwise, I'm going to go through it and just briefly restate what we've already pulled out of this document. This as is with inspection and the right to terminate. You simply indicate what time frame you want to have your inspection completed and put it on the document, and all the other language is there. One of the differences that we discussed in this document versus your inspection contingency is that this is not a contingency, and that the seller does not have to do anything as it pertains to any inspection item that comes back from the buyer with respect to the inspection that they get, okay? The buyer simply has the right to have the inspection for their information. And if there's anything that's too egregious, the buyer can cancel the contract as a result of it, and they will not forfeit their earnest money deposit. So that is a layer of protection, 2 layers of protection. Number one, they get the insight and knowing what's going on with the property. Number two, should they choose to void the contract as a result of the inspection, then their deposit is not at risk. Okay. So that's something to just be aware of. That being said, that is about the limit of the protection that the as is with inspection and the right to terminate offers, right? We talked about some savvy negotiation ways and something that we can do to kind of introduce some language from the inspection notice should the buyer get the inspection and request or desire to request that the seller make any of those repairs on it. Remember, we talked about with this document, the seller has not made any commitment and does not have to commit to completing any of the respective inspection items that come over from the buyer. But when you represent the buyer, if your buyer has inspection requests, you absolutely submit them to the seller, even if the buyer has agreed to purchase as is, okay? The seller has 3 options. The seller can accept to make the repairs, they can reject them, or they can counter them. And most of the time, the sellers are going to counter them, meaning that they may be agreeable to making some, but not all. But you just prepare your buyer in advance. So I'm going to ask you this question, Curtis. Have you had any buyers that you use this as is with inspection and the right to terminate? And after the inspection report came back, your buyer said, hey, I want to negotiate these repair items. Have you faced that just yet? And Christian, I see your hand up.
Yes, there was a transaction I was involved in, and it was as is with inspection. But upon doing the inspection, the radon was very, very high and needed remediation. And the seller was informed about it. And the buyer indicated without that remediation, they were not going to move forward. The seller went and put in the remediation for the radon. So I think, just as you said, it gives you, the buyer an opportunity to be able to know what they're buying, at the same time, know the level of risk they can absorb and the level of risk they can say, you know what, I can't take this level of risk.
Great. That goes hand in hand with our discussion because that's an as-is purchase where the buyer came back and asked for some item to be corrected and the seller agreed to do it. How about you, Curtis? What's been your experience when you have buyers that have inspection and they would like to have, some repair items, although they chose to purchase as is with inspection and the right to terminate?
Yep. So I actually had a client that I was working with that we submitted the offer as is with the inspection. Inspection occurred, and even when we looked at the property, we knew that there was going to be some work that would need to be done. The price point that she was in, probably anything was going to have some work done. So we kind of went in knowing that, but once the inspection happened, we really noticed that there was a lot of work that was going to be needed to be done. And so she didn't want the property. So with that, having that as is with the inspection, I was able to get her essentially out of the contract. And, we're still looking, or, so that actually worked out very well, and was one of the things too that I stressed of having a home inspection. Very important to have the home inspection, because there were things we could see, like, sure, you might need new cabinets, you might need this, but when the inspector actually came in, shout out to Mr. Wimbush, he went, did what he did, and there was just a lot of real work, like kind of more serious things that needed to happen. And then I sent the whole list, I sent the inspection report over to them right away, letting them know. And And it was even apparent on the listing side. You know, they knew that sure it needed some work, but they weren't aware, it wouldn't have appraised, you know, like, so they were very quickly in agreement to terminate the contract. And I think the way I've kind of presented it to them too was I'm trying to be helpful to them. You know, like, this isn't working for my buyer. You need to get it back on the market as quickly as you can. Look, we need to go ahead and just terminate this agreement, you know, wrap this thing up, terminate it so you can get it back out and really find an investor. You know, it was kind of the property needed, or a handyman, you know, somebody that could kind of come in and do some things to it. But having that document allowed us kind of a way. I still personally think she could have probably moved forward with it, but that's a whole nother. that's just the price point, what you're getting. You know, yeah, you know, it's like, oh, okay. So, but yeah, it worked out for her, and it, you know, she was able to get out, and you know, she was happy.
Excellent. So that's exactly how this form is supposed to be used, guys, to offer protection to our buyers in a competitive market, right? Because if all things were equal and, you know, there was kind of a balance in the market with homes available versus buyers in the market, then buyers would have a lot more leeway to request their regular inspection contingency and win them the majority of the time. In this market where it's so competitive, this is one of the tools that we've used quite often to get our buyers' offers accepted. So again, the protection offered by this as is with inspection and the right to terminate is such that the buyer has the ability to get an inspection, and the buyers, their earnest money deposit, their earnest money deposit, forgive me, it's late there. Their earnest money deposit is protected up until the time that you put on here. The number of days that we normally ask for is about 7 days. This is not prescribed. If you can get the inspection done in less time, then that's a piece of negotiation there as well. The number of days that you're asking for the time to get that inspection is something that the seller and the listing agent are definitely going to look at. When you're asking for 15 days to get an inspection, that is not as appetizing to the seller. But if I were you, I would get that inspection scheduled within the first 48 hours of being under contract. That's what we endeavor to do at Porterhouse anyway. You get a ratified contract, you schedule your inspection. Of course, you coordinate with the seller and the listing agent, but you want to get that done as quickly as possible because you want your buyer to have that information up front so that they know whether or not they want to spend more time and money in the transaction. Okay. All right, now on to the property inspection addendum, because this is the one that offers the most protection to the buyer. We're going to talk about this in depth, in detail this evening. We went over this kind of in short the last 2 Thursdays ago when we met, and we talked about some of the scopes and limitations of the document. We talked about some of the items to be inspected from A through G, but tonight, let's just take a deep dive into them, okay? So one of the things that's mentioned in bold print, I want to just make sure we reiterate, because buyers that are purchasing even with an inspection contingency, it is not intended for making items of routine maintenance and or cosmetic nature the subject of further negotiations, right? So if it's something that they would routinely need to maintenance, or, you know, something like paint, or, you know, something that's cosmetic, those are not items that the buyer should be focused on when they are requesting repairs from the seller, okay? So you see different inspection items. You see structural and mechanical. You see mold. I want to talk just a little bit about this because the structural and mechanical, that's the most general inspection that we get all the time, right? That being said, some of these other fields may not be elected, like your mold, your environmental, your radon, your chimney, so forth and so on. But under your mold, your structural and mechanical, you're going to specify the number of days, and that'll be the same for each one of these, that your buyer is getting to actually have this inspection completed, okay? So as we go further down, we're going to talk about the response times, because this addendum, it gets a little bit tricky in terms of the number of days that you put down for your contingency, but how long negotiations that pertain to repairs can actually go on. And when you're on the buyer side, it's favorable for the buyer. And we'll talk about that, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. But when you're on the listing side, you really got to look out for this when it comes to your seller client, so that you can close up some of the gaps as quickly as possible and get that transaction to settlement. Okay. In terms of a mold inspection, if your buyer ever needs to do the mold inspection, this is usually not one that can be completed in 7 days. Oftentimes with a mold inspection, they need more time. With a mold inspection, if there is mold found, then usually it has to, or if there's a mold like subject that is suspected by the home inspector, then normally they have to take samples, and the samples taken by the mold inspector are then sent out to a lab, and the lab has to confer and determine what type of mold it is and toxicity levels and all that kind of stuff. So if you're ever in a situation with kind of like a funky purchase and your buyer wants to buy and you're saying, well, that, you know, there's some discoloration there, I would recommend you get a mold inspection. Just be aware that that will normally take more than your 7-day time period. Okay. So what this highlights is that at the buyer's expense, the buyer will be able to have a qualified expert selected by them to take the samples and do the mold inspection. Okay. Then the laboratory results along with the complete report will be submitted to the seller if there is any problem. Okay. The same thing goes with every item to be inspected on here. If the buyer is requesting any inspection repairs from the seller, then they have to send over a copy of those requests along with the whole report. Okay. Environmental, this is the one that I see people choose least of all. All right. Now, this was in the event that they had any action items that pertained to the existence of asbestos, let's see, underground gas or oil tanks or urea formaldehyde, the IFFIs, EIFSs, polybutylene piping, mold spores, and other items. That's when we would request an environmental inspection. That is the one that we see least often. But this very next one is very important, guys, this radon. And Walter Wimbush talks about this radon inspection all the time. And some of you who work in multiple counties, you know that in other counties like Montgomery County, this is a requirement. So in Prince George's County, it's not yet a requirement, but it should be a requirement, because with radon, it's one of those things, it's a silent killer. So prayerfully, we don't have any buyers that have radon issues that the seller is unwilling to mitigate. Whenever we've had a radon issue, the seller has been willing to mitigate it in order to move forward, because it is a matter of health concern to both the seller and the buyer. Okay. Chimney inspection. If the property doesn't have a chimney, then of course you don't need a chimney inspection, right? Lead-based paint hazard inspection. If the property is built after 1978, then this is not an inspection that you need. If it was built before 1978 and your buyer desires to have this type of inspection, then that's when you would utilize that. Okay. We talked about the provision of paragraph G, where it says additional inspections. The buyer at the buyer's expense has the right to have the property inspected for. And I was talking to you guys about something that looks a little bit less intimidating to the seller, because you and the buyer can elect to choose one or all of these paragraphs to have inspected. But you want to have the conversation with the buyer about getting their offer accepted at the same time. And sometimes it looks a little bit less intimidating to the seller if you put any or all of paragraphs A through G under this section G. So then it still gives your buyer the ability to have any or all of those inspections, but it's not, you know, it doesn't look intimidating, for lack of a better term here. Okay. So those are the things that we talked about. Now I want to go into some of the weightier matters of this inspection contingency. All right, because we talked about the protections that are offered on your as is with inspection and the right to terminate versus this property inspection contingency. And this is where that kind of comes to light. So as it pertains to the inspection, the seller shall make the property accessible for the inspection and shall have the utilities on. And of course, neither the buyer or their contractor can excavate or penetrate or otherwise damage the property. But we're going to go down a little bit more. The inspection report process. So your buyer has the right to either terminate the contract, they can waive their right to terminate the contract by not asking for any repairs. We talked about the buyer's general right to terminate the contract. And I'm going to pause right there for a minute because I'm talking about the buyer's waiver of rights to terminate the contract versus the buyer's general right to terminate the contract. And I want to see if anybody remembers the conversation that we had about paragraph 4B on this inspection addendum. If you do, go ahead and unmute yourself or raise your hand, because I want to see if you guys were paying attention in the training that we had about that. All right, who wants to volunteer to read paragraph 4A for us? All right, let's see who we have on the line. Skipper, Angela, would you read paragraph 4A for us, please?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. 4A, waiver of buyer's right to terminate contract.
Yep.
If within the time period specified, buyer fails to have inspection performed, or if buyer pursuant to paragraph 4C below fails to submit entire inspection report to seller, along with a separate written statement indicating what conditions in the report are considered unsatisfactory and what corrective action and or credit is requested, buyer shall be deemed to have accepted as satisfactory said inspection report, and buyer shall have no right thereafter to terminate the contract or request corrective action pursuant to the provisions of this addendum. If buyer elects not to request corrective action from seller as a result of an inspection, buyer shall not be required to submit a copy of the inspection report to seller.
Excellent. Why is that so important, guys? If we're asking the seller for 7 days to have the property inspected, you get the inspection, your buyer has a whole list of items, and today is day 8. Why is that paragraph important? And this should be a giveaway.
Because you, by day 8, you're short. You gotta go ahead and take that property exactly the way that it is.
That is exactly right. That is
Just
exactly right. If the buyer
creates
doesn't
that urgency.
respond, you got it. Say that one more time. It creates an urgency.
Urgency. And that's one of the things with the buyer consultation that we do. And, you know, talking with your buyers is like, look, once we're ratified, things are rolling. And we immediately, the day of ratification, I'm reaching out to the home inspector, or, you know, we're trying to make that appointment so we can get in, get it done, get the report back. And then if anything needs to go back, hot potato, send it back over. So it's in. We hit that 5-day, 7-day contingency.
Absolutely. Otherwise, they've waived their right. Okay. Angela, you did such a great job with paragraph 4A. Would you read paragraph 4B to us as well, please?
Sure. 4B, notice.
Buyer's general right to terminate the contract. Oh, yes. Yes, you can start at notice.
Okay, this paragraph 4B shall not apply unless initialed by both buyer and seller. If this paragraph 4B is initialed only by buyer, then no binding contract shall be deemed to have been formed by and between the parties, even if this addendum has been signed by both buyer and seller, unless seller shall delete this paragraph 4B by strike through, duly initialed by seller, which deletion shall be deemed to be a counter offer by seller to buyer for acceptance by buyer. If buyer wishes to accept the deletion of this paragraph 4B, then buyer shall evidence such acceptance by initials of buyer.
Keep going.
Buyer, upon written notice to seller, given within the time period specified for each inspection contingency, shall have the unconditional right to terminate the contract for no stated reason, based upon buyer's general dissatisfaction with the inspection results. If buyer elects to terminate the contract shall become null and void, and all deposits shall be dispersed in accordance with the deposits paragraph of the contract.
Perfect. All right, guys, sum it up. What is paragraph 4B saying? And the language that Angela just read for us is a dead giveaway. What is paragraph 4B saying? I'll give you a hint. It's in line 2 of paragraph 2, and it starts with have the unconditional right to terminate the contract for no stated reason. So if the buyer elects to initial paragraph 4B of the inspection addendum, then the buyer is asking for the unconditional right to terminate the contract for no stated reason, okay? So when you are on the buyer side of the contract, this is the utmost in terms of protection for the buyer. The only time that I would suggest using something like this is if, or when I say using something like this, I mean having the buyer to initial paragraph 4B, is if you're in a situation that you're going to a property and the property, you can already see that there's going to be a ton of work that's going to be required for the property. Or maybe it's a bank-owned property and they are, you know, whatever the case is. But if your buyer, you go see the property and you foresee that there's quite a bit and the buyer may or may not be caught off guard with the inspection report, then in that case, that is the only time that I would truly recommend using that paragraph, although it's the buyer's choice as to whether or not they want to use that paragraph. Okay. That being said, tell me how that sounds on the seller side. So tell me, you know, from the perspective of this is the utmost protection for the buyer. On the seller side, how does this look when you have an offer presented with paragraph 4B initial by the buyer? And this is a dead giveaway because we talked about this 2 Thursdays ago. Christian, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
It's an indication that the buyer is not competitive enough, in the sense that a seller would prefer to deal with somebody that they are sure will commit. This is a kind of less commitment to the contract by the buyer.
It's definitely far less commitment to the contract. Does anybody else have anything that they'd like to add?
Well, from the seller side, it really gives them no protection at all. You could still move forward with the contract, you know, but I wouldn't, you know, they would not, they would not initial that pretty much ever. When would be a time though, actually, when would a time where your seller would initial, would it be where they know that the property is in such disarray? Or, I mean, I don't think I would ever want to, my seller to ever really initial this.
If they have no other options, then and only then, because when you're working on the buyer side, that's the utmost protection for the buyer. But when you're working for the seller, then all of your fiduciary goes to the seller. And when you're the listing agent, you're aiming for paragraph 4B in that inspection contingency when you see that addendum coming over. And your goal is going to be to ensure, as the listing agent protecting your seller, that that paragraph is not initialed by the buyer. And if it is, then you are going to instruct your seller, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, that means that the buyer has the unconditional right to terminate, and they are not as committed to the contract or as competitive in this nature as Christian put it there. So you want to have your seller to immediately counter that provision. And that's what Angela read. The seller would counter that provision. How?
Strike through.
Yep. They would do a strike through of that paragraph and initial beside it. So there is no benefit to the seller to accept an offer that has this provision. Okay. That being said, every now and again, you're going to have either an agent who doesn't know any better or a seller who doesn't know any better, and you're going to have some of the inspection contingency addendum. They will be accepted with this provision because not all agents are aware of what it reads, and nor are the sellers aware. So that's why, as a Porterhouse Realty Pro, you guys have got to be adept at this information so that you can clearly communicate it to your buyer and to your seller client as well, so that we can protect their interests. All right. Now, here is where things start to get a little bit extensive, right? So we've talked about the provisions of paragraph 4. We went through A, we went through B, and now we're down to C, the buyer's specific right to terminate the contract, okay? Now, hypothetically, if we had, the inspections there and we had 7 days for each one of those inspections, or just 7 days in general for the buyer to get that property inspection and to submit those results to the seller for their inspection request items, here is where things start to become a little bit extensive. So let's see. Curtis, would you read paragraph? So the buyer specific right to terminate the contract. If you can do the first 2 paragraphs for us there, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. So this paragraph 4C shall apply in the event paragraph 4B is not initialed by both buyer and seller, or if paragraph 4B is initialed by both buyer and seller, but buyer elects not to terminate the contract pursuant to paragraph 4B. Within 5 days from receipt of notice from buyer of an unsatisfactory inspection report, seller shall notify buyer in writing whether seller at seller's expense will repair or correct all, some, or none of the conditions noted by buyer and or offer a credit. If seller elects to repair or correct all of the stated unsatisfactory conditions, the contract shall remain in full force and effect. The seller shall repair or correct in a good and workmanlike manner and prior to settlement all of the unsatisfactory conditions noted by buyer.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. There is so much information there, guys. The first thing I want to pull out is there's a 5-day provision. So your buyer has offered or asked for 7 days for a contingency. Now we're adding another 5 days on top of that. So now you have 13 days that you've been going through this inspection process, right? Look at it from the buyer side when you're representing the buyer, and look at it from the listing side when you're representing the seller. So your seller client has 5 days to respond to the buyer. What should the seller be doing within that 5 days to make sure that they have proper insight so that they know how to respond to the buyer? Is there anything that would be helpful if the seller took time to do within that time period? And I'll give you guys a hint. If the buyer is requesting repairs, then there are contractors that do those repairs or items that the seller will have to purchase along the lines of getting, quotes if they need to, or going to check prices for some things so that they know how to respond to the buyer. All right, that one was a giveaway for you guys. That being said, the seller has the ability, if the buyer has not elected paragraph 4B on here, the seller has the ability to accept, counter, or reject the buyer's repair requests. Okay. If the buyer, where are we? Let's see. Now, one of the provisions under this paragraph is how the work must be completed. And you heard Curtis read, it must be completed in good and workmanlike manner and prior to settlement. Okay, good and workmanlike manner. So that's a big deal, because if you have something that is not contractually stipulated to be completed in good and workmanlike manner, you can have a seller to go and do it themselves and say, I did it, it's done, I've met the contractual obligation. But with this contingency, it says it has to be done in a good and workmanlike manner. And the buyer has the ability to come back and reset it and re-inspect it to make sure that they are satisfied with it. Okay, let's see, for the next 2 paragraphs, Christian, would you read that for us, please? Starting with, if the seller elects to repair. Christian, are you able to read that for us? If not, I'll go on.
You can go on.
Right.
I can be able to read. Yes, thank you.
No problem. Talita, are you in a space where you're available to read for us?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Would you start paragraph 3 under C, if the seller elects to repair or correct?
If seller elects to repair or correct only some or none of the unsatisfactory conditions or fails to respond within the 5-day period, buyer by written notice to seller given within 2 days of receipt of seller's notice or from the date of such written notice was to have been provided by seller may elect either to terminate the contract or waive the right of repair or correction of any unsatisfactory conditions which seller will not repair or correct. If buyer elects to terminate the contract shall become null and void, and the deposit shall be dispersed in accordance with the deposit paragraph of the contract.
Pause
If
right
buyer-
there for just a moment. Pause right there for
Okay.
just a moment. That's excellent. Thank you so much, Tillotson. All right, guys, now we're talking about how this just continues to unfold for the buyer, and it's in favor of the buyer. So when you're on the buying side, you got to be aware of how to manage these timelines on behalf of the buyer, okay? When you're on the listing side, you got to be aware of how to manage these timelines for your seller. On the buyer side, we've already said that they have 7 days to get the inspection. The seller has 5 days to respond. And now after the seller's 5th day of response, the buyer has 2 more days to let them know whether or not they're going to accept the seller's response or cancel the contract. So you've effectively taken that to 2 weeks worth of time that the buyer can now cancel the contract, okay? And this is based on the seller's response. Now, of course, if the seller agrees to complete all of the items, then the buyer has to continue with the contract. It remains in full effect and it is not null and void. But if the seller counters just one item there or all of those items or, anything that is not a full acceptance of the buyer's inspection requests or their repair requests, then now the buyer has 2 more days to say, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, I'm going to accept your counter, or you know what, I'm still going to cancel this contract. Okay. Very important to note. So now you're out to day 14. Be aware of that. Okay. Go ahead. Tell it if you can pick back up at if buyer waives. I'll take that for you. If buyer waives the right of repair or correction of any conditions which the seller will not repair or correct, or if the buyer within 2 days of receipt of the seller's notice fails to notify the seller of buyer's election to either terminate the contract or to waive the right to repair or correct any unsatisfactory conditions which the seller will not repair or correct, the contract shall remain in full force and effect, and the seller shall repair or correct in good workmanlike manner and prior to settlement all of the unsatisfactory conditions which the seller agreed to repair or correct. Okay, this is important because the buyer is given another 2 days after the seller responds. Okay, seller A. Okay, let's take from buyer A. So buyer, Betty buyer, she's purchasing the contract. She gets the inspection done. She reaches out to, Sam seller. Sam seller says she had 7 days. Sam seller receives her request for repair items. Now Sam seller has 5 days to respond. Sam seller responds with a counter. He didn't accept everything. Now he's responded with the counter. So now, Betty buyer, she has a whole nother 2 days to say whether or not she's going to move forward. However, if she does not respond within that 2 days, then she has effectively accepted Sam seller's counter. Okay. As Curtis said so eloquently, time is of the essence. So be aware that your response times are crucial. Another thing Curtis said is hot potato. So when you get it, make sure that you satisfy whatever is necessary on behalf of your client so that those provisions are not voided by a lack of response during that time period. Because let's say by chance it's a matter of 20 repair requests that the buyer has made. And the seller may have said, you know what, I'll repair one of those things. And within that 2-day time frame, the buyer doesn't respond to say whether or not they accept it, they counter it, they reject it, and they want to void the contract. If they don't respond at all, then they have effectively accepted the seller's counter and they void their right to terminate the contract after that 2-day time period. Okay. Now, here's another thing, and this is something that most people are not aware of. So I want you guys to pay attention. because we've already gotten to the point where we're 14 days into the contract with negotiations, but on the face of it, it looks as if it's only a 7-day negotiation window. But you can see from the time periods highlighted in these additional paragraphs, we're all the way down to 14 days into this, okay? Now, guess what? We're gonna add another 2 days onto that, because if the seller offers the buyer a credit, the buyer, by written notice to the seller given within 2 days of receipt of the seller's offer, may either elect to terminate the contract or accept the credit. I'm going to read that again. If the seller offers the buyer a credit, the buyer, by written notice to the seller given within 2 days of receipt of the seller's offer, may elect either to terminate the contract or accept the credit. Okay? I want you guys to think about this, and when your brain starts to, burst and you see the magnitude behind this, I want you to be courageous and unmute yourselves and tell me what you think about it, or raise your hands if you have any thoughts now. But I want us to be well aware that we've gone from a 7-day contingency period in which our buyer can pull out to now you went to 5 more days added by the seller, 2 more days added by the buyer. And now in the event that the seller offers a credit, the buyer has a whole nother 2 days to cancel the contract, just because the seller offered a credit. So be aware of that, because when you're on the buying side, you got to know how to strategically, kind of navigate through these documents for the most protection for your buyer client. You got to know how to do that strategically. And that's why we're walking through these different timelines. The same thing goes for you on the listing side. When you're representing the seller, you've got to know how to strategically help prevent calamity on the listing side, in hopes that the buyer's agent is not aware of all of these things in there, and their buyer's not aware of all of those provisions. Because if they're not, you do not make them aware of any of those things. You represent the seller. And the same thing on the buying side, you represent the buyer. Depending on the hat that you're wearing at the time, that's the position that you're going to take in terms of protecting the client or strategically maneuvering through the transaction in light of these things that benefit your client. Okay. Does anybody have any thoughts, any questions, any comments, any new insight from that information? I'll pause for just a moment. What do you guys think about that? The buyer gets a whole nother 2 days. So we're after day 14. Now we're into 16 days of potential negotiations, in which time the buyer can still pull out and not lose their earnest money deposit. What do you guys think about that? All right, then we'll continue. If you have any thoughts, go ahead and unmute yourself. Otherwise, we will just keep moving on along. All right, if the buyer elects to terminate the contract shall become null and void, and the deposit shall be dispersed in accordance with the deposits paragraph of the contract. If the buyer accepts the credit, or if buyer within 2 days of the receipt of the seller's notice fails to notify the seller of the buyer's election to either terminate the contract or accept the credit, the contract shall remain in full force and effect. And the seller shall credit the buyer the amount the seller offered at settlement, subject to the lender approval. Okay, so here's another key component of this. Any seller credit is subject to the lender approval. And it goes on to say, if it's the buyer's responsibility to confirm with the lender that the entire credit provided for herein may be utilized. Okay, so it's the buyer's responsibility to confirm. Let's say by chance you have a property that has a whole litany of repair items, and your buyer wants all of them. And the seller says, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I'm not going to do those 30 items that you've requested, but I'm going to offer you a $10,000 credit so that you can have those items completed after settlement yourself. Your buyer says, oh, thank you, Mr. Seller. I really appreciate that, right? Your buyer just, if it's a non-porterhouse buyer, they just accept it and they put it on there. They don't reach out to the buyer's lender. The buyer doesn't reach out to their lender. You get to the time where your alt is being completed for settlement, or some type of underwriting that triggers the lender to say, hey, of that $10,000, the buyer can't use anything other than $2,000 of it. So that credit, the buyer can only use $2,000 of that credit. So now we've gone past the inspection contingency, we've gone past the negotiations, we've gotten past all of those different, kind of little trap doors, if you will, in the transaction. And if you and the buyer, specifically the buyer's responsibility, but depending on the side of the transaction you're working on, if you're working with the buyer, you assist the buyer. You reach out to the lender, say, hey, Michael Cooper, the seller's offering my buyer $10,000 in credit. Can this buyer use that full $10,000? If he says yes, great. If he doesn't, then you got to be aware of that, because it can absolutely happen, and has happened before at the settlement table or just before then, where the seller's credit to the buyer was chopped way down to the only thing that was acceptable by the lender, and the seller got away, and we were representing the seller. So this was a benefit for our Porterhouse client, because the buyer didn't do their due diligence and their agent didn't do their due diligence as well. The buyer wasn't able to use the full credit, so the money was able to stay in the seller's pocket. And based on this document, the seller didn't have to make the repairs, because the buyer and the seller swapped credit for repairs. So then they didn't verify. So then the seller, I think, only ended up having to contribute like $2,000 or something like that in repairs for a list of repair items that they had previously agreed to do much more for. And not because the seller didn't desire to, but because it would affect the buyer's approval. Okay, that was a mouthful. What do you guys think about that? How does that make you feel in terms of, the contract and looking at repairs and credits and all of those things? What do you think about it? Tell me what your thoughts are. As you think about it, I'll continue to read. If the lender prohibits the seller from payment of any portion of such credit, then the said credit shall be reduced to the maximum amount allowed by the lender. So be aware when you are on the buyer side of the transaction, when it comes to those credits. Number one, the buyer has 2 additional days to cancel the contract because the seller offered a credit. Be aware of that, right? And number 2, that credit amount has to be approved by the lender. Otherwise, it can be reduced to any amount that is approved by the lender. Okay. And on the selling or on the listing side, you got to know that so that you can help your client to navigate. All right.
Just to chime in, I think that it's a very, I know for me, when I first started out, I was very excited to get ratified and to get under contract. And that over time, I guess because the ratification means we're accepted, we're on a contract. And I mean, that's what we're after. And that's kind of the, when you can exhale a little bit. But in all actuality, once you get through this, like this is the real, like once you're ratified, now the home and like all of these things that we're talking about tonight are the real on the buying side, are the real on the buying side as it pertains to the agent, are the real kind of like, the heavy things. Like you got to get through this. So, being mindful of how quickly, because like you're saying, Jasmine, with the 14 days, those are the maximum days. That doesn't mean it has to stretch the full 14. If you're doing your due diligence, you can kind of have this, even the back and forth thing of like the repair or this needs to be fixed. They're going to give a credit for X dollars, or they're going to fix this. These things can be done in 4 days, all of it. But it's the staying on top and making sure that we get through the inspection portion of the deal, like, because once, in a way, it's kind of like once we get through that, that's when you can kind of exhale a little bit on the buying side, because at that point, it's appraisal and their money. Are they going to actually get, the funding? So then it's really now on the lender, and they're really now working with the lender and going back and forth to get their money straight for settlement. So you can kind of, exhale a little bit until you get to closing. But, this is just so powerful and very important once we're ratified, is to get through these contingencies, to get through this inspection period. Because once you're done that, then it's kind of like, okay, you can woo-saw a little bit and make sure that the deal just keeps moving along how it needs to. But this is all very, very powerful, very important information for all of us, representing the buyer. you know, of course, on the listing side as well, but really, you know, very important stuff. So yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for your insight there. Guys, I want you guys to just take this information in. It may take you a moment to absorb it. You may want to call and just dialogue about it a little bit more, but I'm going to tell you, most agents are not aware of the length of all of these back and forth negotiations in there, especially that part with regards to the seller offering a credit gives the buyer a whole nother opportunity to terminate the contract. And that can very well be day 16, and you only asked for a 7-day contingency. But now, because you've gotten through all of those steps, you're on day 16, and now the buyer's responding to the seller's offer of a credit on day 14. It happens. So be aware of these things, okay? So in light of the added protection that this inspection contingency offers the buyers, you see paragraph number 5, repairs, corrections, and reinspection. So the seller agrees to complete the repairs and to provide receipts in sufficient time for the buyer to reinspect the property prior to settlement. That is a big deal. When the seller provides, they complete it and they provide them the receipts. Okay, so we already know it has to be done in good workmanlike manner. It has to be done by duly licensed professionals. They got to provide them with the receipts, and the buyer has to be able to re-inspect it. So the buyer shall have the right to inspect the property upon the completion of the repairs or corrective action by the seller to confirm that the seller has performed in a good workmanlike manner all of the repairs and corrective actions which the seller agreed to perform. What is this saying? This is saying with this addendum, the buyer effectively has the ability to go in and nitpick should they choose at the seller's repairs. So if the seller had somebody to come out and do something, the buyer can go say, I'm not satisfied with the way that that was done. I think that that item needs to be corrected a little bit more. Now, that being said, that doesn't happen all the time, but with the language in paragraph 5 of this inspection addendum, it absolutely opens it up for the buyer to be satisfied with the state of the repairs and for the property and for them to re-inspect the property so that based on their, their specifications that it was done in good workmanlike manner, if you will. So just know that on the buying side, your buyer has a whole lot more leeway with this addendum. And on the listing side for your sellers, just know that the buyer has a whole lot more leeway with this addendum, okay? And then the last piece of information on here, if the buyer or the buyer's agents or contractors damage the property during the exercise of the buyer's rights of the addendum, except for damage caused by the seller's negligence, the buyer shall pay promptly or reimburse the seller for all costs incurred in correcting such damage. So just be aware, if your buyer or the agent or the inspector damages the property, then the buyer is responsible for paying to correct those damages. Okay, I want to reiterate that again because on a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the as is without inspection. And one of the agents asked, hey, even if you say without inspection, do you have the right to get it inspected anyway? And without inspection, the inspector doesn't necessarily have the authority from the seller to move anything for the sake of damaging, because then the buyer's responsible for that. So I'll just reiterate that slightly. You want to have express written permission to get those inspections done by your buyer who's purchasing the property, because when you're on the listing side, it's the buyer who's responsible for the damage. If you're on the listing side and you have buyers who are getting inspections on the property, but they are purchasing as is without inspection, they don't have express written permission to get an inspection. They have inspectors that are coming out to the property and somebody damages something. Then the question becomes, who is the person responsible for that? Okay. So all other terms and conditions of the contract or sale will remain in full force and effect. That is your inspection contingency, guys. What do you guys think about all the language that's in this inspection contingency? That's my first question. I'll pause right there for that. And let's see if we have a chance to go through this inspection notice. We have a few more minutes to go through the inspection notice. If you guys have any questions or any key takeaways about that inspection addendum, go ahead and unmute yourselves and you can add your insight to the discussion. Otherwise, we will move ahead and talk about the property inspection notice. All right. So whenever you have an inspection contingency, The official instrument that you convey the repair request to the sellers on is this document. This is your property inspection notice, not a general addendum, the property inspection notice, okay? There is language that makes this pursuant to the property inspection addendum. And we talked about some specific strategies when you're representing the buyer, but those same strategies you got to look out for when you're on the listing side representing the seller. Okay. We talked about purchasing as is with inspection and the right to terminate versus with the inspection contingency wholesale. This document is hand in hand with the inspection contingency. If you are working with a buyer, such as what Curtis said earlier and what Christian said earlier as well, you have a buyer who's purchasing as is with inspection and the right to terminate, and that buyer says, hey, Christian, or hey, Angela, hey, Talitha, I want you to ask the seller for these inspection items. Yeah, I understand that I purchased as is with inspection and right to terminate, but I want to request these items of the seller. This is the document that you use in that case as well, okay? I say that because the contract is not subject to this document when you purchase as is with inspection of right to terminate. It is subject to this document when you purchase with the inspection contingency. However, you can strategically include this in your negotiation when your buyer requests inspection repair items, so as to provide the buyer with this level of protection, okay? If you have a savvy listing agent on the other side, they're gonna say, oh, no, the property, the contract is not subject to this document. So the seller is not gonna accept this document. If they are willing to do some of the repairs, they're willing to do it, but it's not gonna be subject to the language in the property inspection addendum or in that notice. If you have a savvy listing agent and they are aware. If they are not aware, then they will not know, and they will send this on over to their seller clients. So be aware that when you represent the buyer's interest is what you are pursuing, their best interest, okay? When you're representing the seller, it's the seller's best interest that you're working towards. Does anybody have any questions about that?
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
So in regards of representing the seller, just say we're willing to do a $5,000 credit at closing. We would just make a general addendum that seller hereby, credits buyer $5,000 due to various, or just $5,000 at settlement, and not use this document.
You are absolutely right. That would go on either the seller contribution addendum or a general addendum. But when you effectuate the terms of this addendum, then you notice that it's already pursuant to the property inspection addendum. So it's kind of effectuating terms, of language that wasn't previously in the contract that now they come into play when you introduce this document. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So this would be as is. So the buyer agreed as is with, right to inspection. So now the seller's like, okay, look, I'll throw in 2,000, but I'm not going to use this form. I would then use a general addendum, or seller contribution for $2,000. However, if it's not as is, if it's the regular, inspection addendum, then this applies either way.
Yes.
Okay.
Got it. Does anybody
Thank
else
you.
have any further questions about that? All right, then I am going to pause with this addendum because I don't think I would do it any justice if I just went through it in the next couple minutes or so. I will highlight a couple points and we will dive into it a little bit more deeply next week. Essentially, what this addendum is doing is it's highlighting the inspection that was completed, whether or not there were items that were unsatisfactory, if the buyer elects to terminate, or if the buyer has attached a copy of the report and they're asking for the repair items, okay? If the repair items are requested from the buyer, then they're going to be made right here in paragraph 2C of this property inspection notice. If there are additional items that are needed and there's not enough space given here, then you can add an addendum that is an addendum to this inspection notice, okay? But as you can see, the buyer has to sign and then the seller has to respond. So all of the language that we went through in that the property inspection contingency, whereas the days going back and forth, so forth and so on. Now, this is the response from the seller to the buyer. Either the seller agrees to complete all, will not complete any of them, or complete some of them. And then the seller responds there. Or if the seller agrees to give the buyer a credit, this is where the seller responds. And then the buyer responds to the seller's response. So this is a back and forth countering. It's a 4-part, I'm not going to say fiasco, but it's a 4-part. If there are 4 components to it in which the buyer makes an offer, the seller counters, and back and forth there. Okay, Christian, I see your hand up.
Yes.
Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah. My question is, if the seller makes an offer for credit instead of repair, for instance, the buyer looks at what needs to be repaired to be 10,000, and the seller comes up and say, okay, I'm gonna give you 5,000 credits. Within the 2 days, can the buyer counter offer and say, okay, you're gonna give me 8,000 because I know that this is gonna cost 10,000, but I'm willing to take 8,000 if you wanna give me credit instead of repair. Can that be done in such a situation?
Yes, that can be done. So the buyer can counter the seller's response.
Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
You got it. Okay, and that was a great question. We are going to stop there for tonight with regards to those addendum. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. But I want to hear from you guys a little bit before we end. We have about 5 minutes left. All right.